Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. The invitation for this event, I'm going to be paraphrasing here, but it offered three choices, I think it was, for how one views the outcome from Copenhagen. Critical historical moment, dismal failure, and place that some important things good things got done. Is that within some range of accuracy? I think that was what it is. And I'm going to suggest that the answer is all three, in fact, and that we need to think about it from a perspective that, in fact, gives us a sense of its being all three. So let me begin by sort of laying out some of the context for thinking about Copenhagen, and then I'll talk a bit about the way forward from here. First, I think it's really important to underscore that Copenhagen was broader than just a particular moment in time, that there was a broader context that emerged around the drive from Bali to Copenhagen, and that was a really important part of what came out of this process. Part of that had to do with massive public mobilization. We and others convened climate hearings on the ground in developing countries around the world with literally tens of thousands of people involved. There were well more than 1 million people in the streets on December 12th, the day that there was a public mobilization during Copenhagen. And there was just a vast increase in public awareness around climate change and climate change policy in the run-up to Copenhagen. I think that was partly demonstrated in the fact that front pages across the world focused on it. There was also unprecedented engagement by heads of state, and I think Bill mentioned the 120 or so heads of state who were, in fact, in person in Copenhagen. And I think that also shows the degree to which this increased the political engagement around the world. And there were developing country actions. A number of developing countries, including China, India, Mexico, Brazil, all in the run-up to Copenhagen announced actions that they were going to take on reducing emissions, and I think there was also an increased engagement on the adaptation front as well. So all of that in a package, I think, shows that this moment did do a lot. It of course relied on civil society in many ways mobilizing and governments mobilizing in ways that aren't necessarily reflected in the words on paper at the end of the day. But I think it crystallized engagement around climate change in a way that has been really, I think, unmatched before. Secondly, let me turn to the difficult process in Copenhagen. There's been a lot written about how difficult the 2 weeks were, how difficult the last 24 hours were in particular. And I think all of that is true. But I think this climate chaos, if you want to call it that, reflects what is the political reality in the world around climate change. That it is a complicated political dynamic, and it can't simply be glossed over. The dynamics and the complications can't simply be glossed over, and we saw those dynamics emerging in full public view in Copenhagen. And just a few examples of why those dynamics were complicated. I think one has to do with the United States, a critical one, and that's the fact that we still have yet to pass comprehensive climate legislation in this country. And that has meant that the U.S. was not able to come forward with an absolutely clear commitment in an unequivocal way about what it would do in terms of reducing emissions or what it would do on the financing front either. Other issues that I think complicated the dynamics were the emergence of a bloc referred to as BASIC, Brazil, South Africa, India, China, not in order of weight within that bloc. But that bloc became a critical part of the negotiating process. And in fact, in an infamous moment at the end, on Friday night, December 18th, it was those 4 countries that met with President Obama to strike the deal. It's sort of infamous in the sense that there's now this story about Obama, somewhat apocryphal and not quite accurate, I think, about Obama barging into the room and sitting down with these 4 other leaders. But in fact, it was that bloc of developing countries that were critical to the Copenhagen Accord outcome. And I think that puts on the table in many ways a stark set of questions about developing countries, differences among developing countries, and how one addresses that. It meant that many vulnerable countries clearly were not sitting at the table at the moment that that deal was struck. There are lots of other dynamics. Latin America is one of those. I think, although it's correct that the 4 Latin American governments that blocked at the end are left-leaning and have fairly strong ideological underpinnings, they do at the same time care deeply about climate change. Bolivia is the leader of that grouping, that loose grouping, and in fact, Bolivia has been quite vocal, and one could quibble with the positions they've taken, but they have been quite vocal about what they see as the threat to themselves from climate change. Africa, there were also complicated dynamics within the Africa bloc, and the list goes on. The point is that we're in a situation where many of the most deeply held beliefs and policy positions of governments were fully on the table. And climate change is not going to be an easy problem to solve. It is one that we can address in a comprehensive way and make substantial progress on, more than was made in Copenhagen. But it is not simply one that can be done without many parties at the table engaging in a serious way, and that does make things a little bit messier. I'll come back to the process at the end. The outcome of the negotiations, let me just quickly go through some of the upsides and downsides. And it was clearly disappointing. I think there's no question about that. President Obama himself acknowledged that. Depending on one's lens, I think what is disappointing about it may be different. But let me put some of the problems on the table. First of all, on the emissions side, it's a bottom-up approach. Bill basically laid out the way in which this will operate. But the issue centrally for many is that instead of saying we need to reduce emissions by such and such on a global level by 2020, and that would principally be developed country emissions that might be named in that way, in putting a number like that in writing on the table at a global level in line with the science, instead of taking that approach, this is a bottom-up approach where governments simply are going to put into a document what they intend their emissions reductions to be. And the analysis that's been done, I'm sure there's more coming, but some of the analysis that's been done shows that based on what governments have said to date about what they're ready to do, we would be on a trajectory for a 3.9 degree Celsius increase over pre-industrial temperatures. And that clearly is outside the bounds of what anybody thinks is acceptable in terms of limiting temperature change. So this bottom-up approach has some real problems with it, and it also, I think, is a departure from the approach of the Kyoto Protocol in many ways, which did have a global reduction target, and that raises lots of questions about the relationship of the Accord to the Kyoto Protocol approach in the past. There are other issues, even down in the weeds, this question of response measures, which is the Saudi agenda around ensuring that they are compensated for lost revenue from oil sales has I think, injected itself into the adaptation discussion now in a way that is particularly unhelpful. And there is beginning to be progress to sideline response measures. A lot of that progress was undone in the Copenhagen Accord itself. And then the legal mandate is missing. There is neither an outcome that is legally binding, nor is there even an arrow now pointing toward achieving a legally binding outcome in Mexico, in Cancun at the next COP at the end of this year, or at any other time. And so we're left in this very unclear legal limbo, which is even exacerbated by the fact that the Accord doesn't have real, even politically binding effect because it was only taken note of. Some of the upsides, the transparency measures that and guidelines that the U.S. and China agree to and that others agree to, I think are extremely important. They are a clear move forward in terms of the relationship between the U.S. and China on climate change. And given that those two countries represent 40% of global emissions, that is in fact movement that should be recognized and applauded. And I think President Obama deserves a lot of the credit for that particular piece of the puzzle. On finance, there are two pieces to what happened there. One is a short-term finance agreement for $30 billion over the next 3 years. The other is a global goal by developed countries of mobilizing, and I'll underscore and put in quotes the word mobilizing, $100 billion a year by 2020 from both public and private finance. It is important that that long-term goal is there, and that is the first time that there has been agreement, certainly by the United States, on a long-term finance objective. However, there are a number of questions still left on the table. The conversation has now been opened, but there are questions about how much of this would come from public or private financing. In the case of adaptation, it's very clear that you don't get where you need to go with private finance, which generally, in this context, is referring to things like carbon offsets. So that leaves a big question mark looming over that global goal. And there are a number of other questions, how the revenues are going to be generated, how they will be divvied up, how the responsibility will be divvied up among developed countries, and so forth. So lots of questions there. Lastly, let me just say that in addition to the Copenhagen Accord, in a sense, there's a whole other set of outcomes of Copenhagen. And that's the formal negotiating text that had been worked on in the 2 years leading up to Copenhagen, and also during the 2 weeks of Copenhagen itself. And there was, in fact, substantial progress in a number of areas during those 2 weeks. And there are formal texts alongside the accord that could form the basis for negotiations going forward. Some of the areas in which there was substantial progress included reducing emissions from deforestation, adaptation, although there's some lingering questions there about vulnerability that are quite important, and technology. So we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that the accord was not the whole story coming out. Where do we go from here? First of all, as I think everybody recognizes, action in the Senate is essential, and Congress as a whole needs to take action on climate change. I think without that, how we move forward in negotiations becomes much, much more complicated. It's also the case that elements within congressional action are critical. For example, the international finance elements in and of themselves are going to be critically important as we look toward further negotiations. There needs to be a re-energized international process and negotiations. Lots of questions coming out of Copenhagen about the UNFCCC, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change process, the one that was the context in which Copenhagen took place. There's been discussion of the possibility of shifting to a G20 context as a venue, perhaps the Major Economies Forum, which is 17 large emitting countries, perhaps a friend of the Accord context, something like that. Our view is that the UNFCCC continues to be the central venue in which climate negotiations take place. That unless you make that the central venue, you will not address critical issues that have to be on the table. Vulnerability, of course, is one of those. Vulnerable countries will not be centrally at a G20 table, for example, or even at an expanded MEF table. I think that there are ways in which vulnerable countries are likely to have their views diluted in the process. And I think especially in the short term, it would not serve the purpose of creating a global consensus and global movement on climate change to be looking at a whole variety of venues and pulling off in various directions. I think what needs to happen in order to make the UNFCCC process work, though, is some reform. One of the questions at the very end of Copenhagen was around this Friends of the Chair process that 20-some-odd countries were involved in. The problem with that process was it wasn't fully transparent how it was constructed, and there was not sufficient buy-in from various types of countries, including regional blocs. And I think we saw some of the outcome of that with what happened with the Latin America countries that blocked at the end, that they hadn't, in fact, been fully integrated into that smaller process. And those smaller processes have to happen because you cannot, in fact, negotiate with a room of this size or larger with everyone able to speak. But you do need to be sure that it is a process, smaller process, is one that can, in fact, adequately represent all the parties who are at the table in that broader room. The other thing is that the process, the international process, should build off both the accord, the elements of the accord that can be usable in our movement forward, and the formal negotiating texts. The texts that had been part of the negotiating process leading up to Copenhagen for the 2 years since Bali. And those are in two tracks of their own. The Kyoto Protocol track to reach a post-2012 agreement, and what's referred to as the long-term cooperative action track, which is the one that brings the U.S., major developing country emitters on board, and also has the finance, both for adaptation and for emissions reduction. So all of that needs to be part of all of these texts that are there, and the progress that's been made need to be part of this process, and it needs to point to a legally binding outcome. I think we need to re-energize the sense that we're going to reach an outcome that's legally binding. I can talk about that more in Q&A. I think that there are complicated dynamics with the basic countries around that question of legally binding. We also need continued movement on the finance issue. The Fast Start funds for the next 3 years are a critical opportunity, and we now have, with FY 2011 appropriations in front of us, immediately in front of us, and the President's budget request immediately in front of us, a real opportunity to begin making good on that Fast Start funding. And there are processes that the Accord points to, particularly I would note the high-level panel that the Accord designates as the place to have a conversation about how to generate resources for international climate finance. That is an opportunity that should be seized. It's not to say that it should make decisions in lieu of the UNFCCC or the Conference of the Parties of the UNFCCC, but it does provide us an opportunity to move the process along in important ways on finance. And then lastly, let me just mention on agriculture, I'm not helping my slides here, but lastly, let me just mention on agriculture and food security linkages to climate change, some of the important opportunities going forward. The formal negotiations at Copenhagen got very close to an agreement on initiating a technical level process on agriculture and mitigation. That could be very helpful, and hopefully that discussion will continue moving forward. Jerry may have something to say about that. I think we were disappointed that that text no longer has references it earlier had to small and marginal farmers. And I think one of the questions going ahead is how that process is going to be constructed, and making sure that, in fact, the interests of small farmers are at the table in a clear way. We and others are going to continue with work on the ground, and I can describe some of this, to do adaptation and also mitigation work in the agriculture sector. We're doing it with rice farmers in Cambodia. We're doing it through the use of microinsurance in Ethiopia and other countries, and we'll continue with that. There also needs to be a look at national funding stream or international funding streams that are now reaching the national level in developing countries from a variety of sources. And we've been working in Bangladesh or starting to work in Cambodia and elsewhere around how you make sure that these are appropriately designed in a way that's going to benefit small farmers. And then lastly, there's U.S. policy. I mentioned appropriations. FY 2011 is right in front of us. There are also opportunities beyond the comprehensive climate bill, such as the food security legislation that Casey and Lugar have been moving forward in the Senate, and there's a companion bill on the House side. And while those only very tangentially mention climate at all, I think that is an opportunity as those bills move ahead to interweave the agriculture and climate change debate in a much clearer way. So let me conclude there. Thank you.